Hello and welcome to our analysis of iCAT08. iCAT8 is part of our All India National Level CAT Test series for CAT 18. In the mocks released so far, that's iCAT9 to 25, you would have encountered a few challengers, that's very difficult mocks, a few easy ones, a few easy to moderate ones. Then there were some mocks which were purely based on the lines of CAT17. Taking into account all these differences in LODs or difficulty levels, you would have now arrived at some sort of a strategy as to how you should attempt each mock and each section within the mock. So when we look at iCAT8, which we'll analyze in three parts corresponding to the three sections, we'll have a look at the difficulty of each section and decide the number of good attempts that would have ensured clearing the cutoff for that section. So firstly, we have a look at the overall difficulty level of iCAT8, which has been classified as a moderately difficult mock. Now, in terms of its numerical value of difficulty, it has been marked at 1.9. What does this mean? As we have explained in all our earlier analysis, each question is given a difficulty level from 1 to 3. 1 implies easy, 2 is moderate, and 3 is tough. So this is nothing but the arithmetic mean of the difficulty level of each question. In simple terms, it means that on an average, each question is close to being moderate. Of course, that will not be the case for every individual question. Just to give you a perspective, in CAT, we've seen that the overall LOD range is somewhere between 1.9 to 1.95. So in that sense, it can be considered to be quite a representative mock with respect to CAT. Let's first have a look at the verbal ability section. As always, this has 24 RC questions and 10 non-RC questions, or what can be called numerical entry or theta, plus para summary questions. So firstly, we observe that verbal ability coincidentally also had the exact same difficulty as the overall mock itself. However, you would note that this has been classified as a moderate to tough section. This is because on the whole, the average difficulty level expected for verbal based on the CAT of last 3 years is around 1.85. So while the overall mock is somewhere at par with the actual exam, the verbal ability was marginally tougher than the actual exam. Now, as we said, there are two parts to this, the RC as well as the non-RC questions. So we start off by first looking at the RC questions. Generally, these RC questions are 5 sets that are asked. The most common breakup is you have 3 sets or 3 passages of 6 questions each plus 2 RCs. Let me call this RCs only. So 3 RCs of 6 questions and 2 RCs of 3 questions, which was also followed in this mock. The arrangement of these RCs can vary as per each mock. Now, let's consider the actual RCs. How do we analyze the RCs? For passages, we generally as students try and look at the subject matter and decide whether we want to attempt that question or the passage or not. We would rather recommend that don't look only at the subject matter. The subject matter is of course important, but at the same time, the subject matter, when coupled with the word length as well as the number of questions, gives you a much better indicator of whether that RC should have been tried or not. There is also a subjective matter here of whether you are conversant with that subject or not. That's one. The other aspect is the actual difficulty level of the questions in that passage. This generally you will come to know only on a post facto basis, that is after the mock is over. But yes, while you are attempting and once you've done 10-12 mocks like you would have done so far, you generally tend to get a gist of whether the passage is tough or not, or the questions are easy or not. So here we start off by looking at the overall sectional LOD and see it is around 1.9. When I see this graph, or when I see the successive LOD of the RCs, I observe that there are two RCs here which clearly stand out as being significantly tougher compared to the overall average difficulty of the section. Contrary to that, there is one RC here which is significantly easier compared to the overall section LOD. And then there are two passages which are more or less at par with the section. So this particular section was characterized by two relatively difficult passages, one easy passage and two moderate passages or passages at par with the section. Let's look at the other aspects. If I start with the very first passage of the mock, I noticed that this was on a slightly readable area called geography. However, when we go a little deeper, you would note that this was a passage written in the British era when the British were ruling India. So the description of places given is quite unlike what you would read today. So the names are unfamiliar. Plus, if you look at the passage, it is the longest passage in this mock with a word length of 960, which means it is tending more towards IFT levels and is nearly double of what we expect in a CAT mock. But at the same time, there is one more complicated aspect, is that it's the toughest passage in this entire section. So when I look at this passage, there are 2-3 flags that would tell me not to attempt it. One, the sheer word length. Two, the fact that the passage has language and places names which are difficult to read, so it becomes a little difficult. It's a description. Go north from this mountain, do this, then you come to this mountain range, then you do this, etc. So it's a little heavy in terms of reading. You might get lost in facts. Plus, the questions are difficult. The final clincher that tells me that this passage might be avoidable is the fact that there are only 3 questions in this passage. Now, why does this tell me that the passage can be avoided? Because after reading such a long passage, if I'm going to attempt tough questions and there are only 3 such questions, the return that I get from spending my time on this passage is quite negligible. That is the reason I would not attempt this passage in the actual exam. This would be a strict no-no. Correspond this or contrast this with the third passage here, which we call tough. Now here there are 2 aspects which actually make it very enticing to attempt. One, that this is the shortest passage of the entire mock, so you would definitely want to read it. But when I look at the questions, yes, they are tough. Of course, I don't get to know it right at the beginning. This particular topic, even when I was reading the topic, it looked very esoteric to me. It was more in terms of sociology and poverty and crime, but it wasn't very readable. Even as a faculty, when I was reading it, this was something which actually appeared dense to me. So if an average student is reading it in an exam scenario, this might actually appear tougher than it is in reality. So, plus the fact, as we said for the first passage, there are again only 3 questions here. So when I look at these 3 aspects, the difficulty level, the subject matter area, and the fact that there are only 3 questions, I would again not attempt it personally in the exam. Somebody else with an arts background or with a sociology background might find this simpler and hence attempt it. There is nothing wrong with that too. Let's come to the other 3 passages now. The second passage, which was again long, probably say 50 to 60% longer than a typical CAT passage, was from a classic piece of literature called The Merchant of Venice. So there are a few characters and the plot is discussed in this passage. So in that sense, it was reasonably readable. Its length was the only thing which was really a put off here, because you would have needed ample time to read this. But once you read it, you can observe that it was a little less than moderate. So here it would be more a case of selecting the right questions to attempt in this passage. But yes, I would potentially keep it as a cross between attempting and not attempting, based on what the other passages would be. When I look at the other two passages, the last one, which is the simplest, was also reasonably short. This is the typical cat length. Also, it was based a little bit on Christianity and the concept of sins. So there was this discussion on big sins and little sins. But yes, it was fairly readable, again being short. And the questions were simple with there being 6 questions. So when I look at these aspects, there are huge positives here. Number of questions, word length, ease of difficulty of the questions, and the subject matter area. So this is definitely something that I would have attempted. When I contrast this now with the only passage left, that is the one on Kayan tribes, this was again more sociology based or anthropology based, where we were discussing tribes of a certain region and their characteristics and their habits, etc. Slightly longer than a typical cat passage. The same difficulty as the passage on Merchant on Venice. Again, the good part was that there were 6 questions. So here, I would rate this again as the same as the Merchant of Venice passage. Typically, here, my attempt strategy would be that I would try and do the entire passage, so one entire passage on little sins, and then between the two passages on Merchant on Venice and Kayan tribes, I would try and do 2-3 questions each, such that on the whole, I end up attempting 3 RCs with close to 11 attempts in these RCs. Typically, we tell people to attempt somewhere close to 3 RCs, but with 15 attempts. Here, even though I am attempting the 3 RCs which have the maximum questions, that's 18, I'm still attempting not more than 2/3. Because these passages are slightly difficult than compared to what we find in the other mocks. Let's now move on to the non-RC questions and see how they could have been attempted. So as you can see, the typical breakup which is followed in CAT and all our other mocks was followed here too. 4 questions on jumbled sentences, 3 on contextual odd man out, and 3 on para summary. Contextual odd man out questions are typically those questions where you have 4 or 5 jumbled statements. You need to arrange them to form a coherent paragraph. But after that, there will be one statement which can be eliminated because it does not fit into the paragraph. So they are slightly tougher compared to standard jumbled sentences. In this mock, we can see that the jumbled sentences ranged from moderate to tough, whereas the contextual odd man out questions were slightly easier. So they were ranging from easy to moderate, while the para summaries were again moderate to tough. So while we tell students to attempt all the theta questions in verbal, here when we say the number of good attempts, we would say that anywhere between 3 to 4 questions also out of 10 would be a decent performance. When I say 3 to 4 good attempts, it means that these are the questions where I am very strongly confident about my chances of getting the right answer. So if I were to look at the number of attempts for this particular mock or this particular section to be precise, I would say in the RCs, I would target somewhere around 11 questions. In the non-RCs or the any questions, I would target somewhere around 3 questions. So on the whole, for this section, anywhere close to 14 to 15 attempts would be a reasonably good performance. Let's have a look at one of the passages. Let's say the one on Kayan tribes. Okay, before that we go to this graph which we'll show you for each section. Here what we do is plot the difficulty level of each question in that section from question number 1 to 34. The blue bars indicate the MCQs, the pink or orange bars indicate the theta or any questions. So as you can see, the very first passage on geography, long and difficult with 2 tough questions. That is the reason we said do not attempt it. Similarly, when I see the passage on Gertie Slayback, which was the sociology based passage, again 2 moderate and 1 tough questions, longish with moderate to tough questions, so I would skip this as well. Whereas when I look at the passage on Merchant of Venice, I see that there are some moderate to tough questions and there are a few easy questions as well. So your question selection becomes extremely critical. And that is one takeaway from RCs, that you do not always Just because you've spent time reading the RC does not mean that you need to attempt the whole RC all the time. It is always better to have 3 correct answers and stop rather than attempting all 6 questions and getting 3 right and 3 wrong. You end up losing more marks that way. Similarly, when I look at the passage on Kayan tribes, a couple of moderate questions, couple of easy questions, then a tough question, so let's skip it, and a moderate question again. So again, your question selection would become very critical. On the other hand, when I look at this passage on little sins, the first 2 questions have been called moderate, yes, but after that I have a clutch of easy questions here. So this is the passage where I would try and maximize my attempts as far as possible. So then when I focus on this passage, sorry, not Gertie Slayback, sorry, the Kayan tribes and little sins, I can potentially look at an average of 4 questions per passage, 3 to 4 questions per passage, and reach 10 to 11 questions in all. Among the numerical entry questions, observe that there's just 1 and 2 simple questions here. The para summaries are all either tough, and then there's 1 easy para summary here. So this part has a couple of easy non-RC questions together. Similarly, this part has this has 1 easy question here. So these need to be found and attempted rather than spending your time on all the other questions at one go. So that way, if we were to look, 14 attempts would seem reasonably achievable. As we said, let's look at one passage and potentially try and solve 1 or 2 questions there. So if we look, this is the passage. The Kayans, the pagan tribes of the Borneo, believe themselves to be surrounded by many intelligent powers, etc. It starts from here, and then there are 3 pretty long paragraphs which end here. Now, in any RC, we say that a question can be factual, which is directly derived or directly given in the passage. You need to search for the right data, or it is purely inferential, which means it is derived from the passage, such that you need to go and read the passage again and then try and solve it, or it is a mixture of the two. So what we recommend to students is you should try and glance through the passage once very quickly, so have a very quick cursory read, then go through the questions, and based on whichever question you are reading, try and read the passage again in a little more detail. That often helps you answer the questions faster. If I look at the questions here, I would notice that the very first question clearly says it can be inferred from the passage. So this is a purely inferential question where this data may not be given directly in the passage. I need to read the whole passage and then based on the passage eliminate each statement and arrive at one answer. Similarly, when I look at the next question, which of the following provides the best explanation for the contextual meaning of the term spiritual powers? So here we are not looking at the literal meaning of the word spiritual powers. We are actually looking at it in the context of the passage or with reference to the passage. So again, for that you need to have read the passage in its entirety. It's purely inferential. Whereas if I look at the next 2-3 questions, if it is assumed that the Kayans had complete conception of merely mechanical causation, which of the following will most likely happen? So again, this is something which is fact plus inference. You need to understand from the passage what mechanical causation is and then apply it to this and then eliminate options and get your answer. The Kayan hangs upon the tomb the garments and weapons and other material possessions of the dead man. How does the passage explain this practice? So there will be a reference to this statement in the passage. Go back to the passage, read its first 2-3 lines, or the lines just before this, the lines after this, you will get a much better idea and you will be able to eliminate 1 or 2 options again. But if you notice, this passage has a lot of inferential questions here, and because of that, it becomes a slightly more difficult passage to answer. But on the whole, if you see, there are definitely 1 or 2 questions in this passage which can be answered pretty quickly. So here it is a matter of reading the passage very thoroughly and then selecting the right question to attempt. Please do not try and attempt all the questions. The same logic can be applied to every passage that you practice in greater or lesser degrees. On the whole, if we were to summarize this section, we can say that it was a moderate to tough section in a moderately difficult mock. Within RCs, it was a little difficult to attempt any particular RC in its entirety. So it was important to select the 3 6-question RCs and attempt 3 to 4 questions each per passage. Also, among the numerical entry questions, which was slightly tougher, it was important to select the 3 or 4 easier questions. On the whole, anywhere around 14 to 15 attempts would be a good performance as far as this section is concerned. Parts 2 and 3 of this analysis will focus on the DILR and quant sections respectively. The videos for all our previous analysis have been put up on our official YouTube channel. You can access these videos by subscribing to our channel by clicking the link given here. To receive notifications every time a new video is put up, just hit the bell button shown. Please feel free to put in your comments, feedback or any questions on the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.